Hat if the loudest headlines about debt, verdicts, and the supposed final downfall revealed less about reality than about the mechanics of modern outrage. This is precisely the question that kicks off the current wave of sensationalist reports that, within just a few weeks, have transformed Meghan Markle from a controversial media star into a supposedly condemned symbol of failure. Headlines speak of $100 million in debt, a career over, a goodbye forever. But behind this dramatic facade, a pattern emerges that has less to do with legalistic sensibilities and more to do with attention. The dynamic follows a familiar pattern. A rumor surfaces, is sensationalized, and then repeated thousands of times. What gets lost in the process is context. The public narrative portrays Meghan Markle as the protagonist of a drama that is supposedly already decided. But on closer inspection, the crucial element of any genuine condemnation is missing. A verdict. No indictment, no guilty verdict, no legal conclusion. Nevertheless, the language of punishment persists because it generates clicks and provides easy targets for scapegoating. The opening to this narrative is deliberately shocking. Large sums of money, harsh words, final consequences. In the logic of digital platforms, such terms function like alarm bells. They trigger reflexes, preventing critical thinking. This effect is amplified, especially with well-known names. For years, Meghan Markle has been at the center of an emotionally charged debate where admiration and rejection collide. Every new escalation, therefore, encounters an already polarized audience. The current wave is fueled by several factors. Firstly, by the visible cooling of professional relationships in the media and PR environment. Secondly, by the waning impact of earlier major projects. However, these real developments are conflated in many reports into a single narrative. The alleged total collapse. Economic pressure becomes a burden of debt, contract terminations become banishment, criticism becomes punishment. The conflation of legal terms with economic and social consequences is particularly effective. The word condemned appears not by chance. It suggests guilt and closure, even if it has no legal basis. In the public perception, market disputes become blurred with moral judgments. Streaming platforms that let contracts expire become judges. PR agencies that decline mandates become juries. The public assumes the role of executioner by clicking, sharing, and commenting. But the true core of the story is more complex and uncomfortable. It's not about a single scandal, but a chain of decisions, expectations, and disappointments. Early success generated enormous attention and equally high expectations. When these weren't consistently met, the narrative shifted. Hope turned into skepticism, and skepticism into derision. The tone became harsher in parallel with the market's waning patience. In this climate, narratives emerge that are more powerful than facts. The figure of $100 million becomes a symbol, regardless of what it actually describes. It stands for megalomania, for failed ambitions, for the supposed proof that everything went wrong. The fact that this sum was originally a contractual valuation and not a personal debt is hardly relevant in the emotional discourse anymore. Thus, an economic reorientation becomes a moral reckoning, a period of uncertainty and endpoint. But this is precisely where the real question begins, one that many reports avoid. If no verdict exists and no debts can be proven, why does the story persist so stubbornly? The answer lies less in the facts than in the need for simple narratives. A clear-cut case of rise and fall is easier to consume than an open, contradictory reality. The unfolding of this drama thus demonstrates above all how quickly public perception detaches itself from verifiable developments. The headlines create the impression of a closed chapter, even though the story is, in fact, in the midst of a transitional phase. Nothing is yet definitively decided. Not professionally, not financially, not socially. And it is precisely this uncertainty that makes the subject matter so compelling. In the end, what remains is a field of tension that is larger than any single individual. It's about dealing with celebrity, about the power of platforms, and about how quickly rumors become supposed truths. Is this truly the beginning of the end, as many claim, or merely the loudest moment of a readjustment that is far from over? Behind the dramatic headlines about an alleged collapse lies a quieter but more revealing signal: the systematic breakdown of professional structures. This is particularly evident in the field of public relations, where a pattern has emerged in recent years that is noticeable even in a crisis-proof industry. Within 5 years, Harry and Meghan changed a total of 11 PR managers. This number far exceeds the norm and is considered a warning sign in professional circles. Public relations thrives on stability, clear responsibilities, and long-term strategy. When experienced professionals repeatedly leave after a short time, it is rarely interpreted as coincidence. Rather, it points to a work environment that is difficult to control, even for seasoned crisis managers. This picture continued most recently when Meredith Maines resigned from her position as Chief Communications Officer in December after only 10 months in office. Her professional background, shaped by leadership positions at Google and Hulu, made her the ideal candidate for a period that actually called for calm and structure. The timing of her departure reinforced the impression of an imbalance. Simultaneously, the US PR agency Method Communications decided not to renew the contract signed just a few months earlier. Subsequently, several large agencies reportedly refused to work with her altogether. This reluctance wasn't attributed to capacity issues, but rather to a reputation for being particularly demanding without deploying the expected budgets. In an industry where reputation is secured for large sums, this is considered a problematic combination. But money alone doesn't fully explain this development. Former employees described an environment characterized by frequently shifting priorities and unclear decision-making processes. Strategies that were valid one day could be discarded the next. For PRTEs, this means constant stress, because consistent communication is the foundation of any successful image management. Without this consistency, even routine work becomes a permanent crisis response. A similar picture emerges within the organization Archwell. From its founding in 2020 until 2024, 18 employees left the foundation. In December 2025, James Holt, a longtime confidant of Prince Harry and the organization's managing director, also announced his departure. Almost simultaneously, layoffs among lower-level staff occurred just before the holidays. The structure visibly shrank, creating the impression of an organization more preoccupied with internal restructuring than with long-term planning. Financial reports reinforce this impression. The foundation's expenditures recently far exceeded its income. Large sums were spent on external consulting and communication services, while direct funding remained comparatively limited. The decision to temporarily manage operational responsibilities from London, despite the clear media focus being on the US, was interpreted by observers less as a strategic move and more as a cost-cutting measure. The overall picture is one that has little to do with isolated missteps but rather with structural problems. A lack of continuity in key positions weakens any organization, especially one under constant public scrutiny. Without stable contacts, the media and business partners lose trust. Projects are harder to position. Criticism goes unanswered for longer, and rumors spread more quickly. This development acts as an amplifier for negative narratives. When experienced intermediaries no longer stand between the public and the protagonists, every headline is perceived more directly and often more harshly. The withdrawal of professional supporters becomes news in itself, fueling speculation about internal conflicts and a loss of control. At the same time, this reveals a fundamental dilemma of modern celebrity. Those who want to maintain maximum control over their own narrative quickly come into conflict with the mechanisms of professional communication, which require compromise and long-term discipline. The desire for autonomy clashes with the demands of a market that expects predictability. Thus, the PR chaos intensifies into a central element of the current crisis, not as proof of guilt or condemnation, but as an indication of a system that threatens to fail under its own pressure. The question remains whether these structures can be rebuilt or whether further departures will follow, further intensifying the public narrative. The real turning point in public perception, however, lies not in internal structures, but in the dwindling external impact. Where once millions tuned in, disillusionment gradually set in. The content, once celebrated as the ticket to a new media era, lost its appeal. What followed was not an abrupt collapse, but a measurable decline in attention. And it was precisely this decline that later became fertile ground for dramatic doomsday narratives. The starting point was spectacular. When the first major production appeared on Netflix, it struck a chord with the times. Curiosity was enormous, expectations sky-high. Within a very short time, records were reported, creating the impression that a lasting formula for success was emerging. But this success was based on a unique factor of exclusivity. The audience tuned in to hear a story they hadn't heard before. Once that story was told, the dynamics shifted. The subsequent projects revealed a structural problem. Formats that focused less on personal conflicts and more on social issues reached significantly smaller target audiences. Documentaries featuring celebrity guests, lavishly produced and ambitious in content, missed the mark with the masses. They quickly disappeared from public viewership rankings and left little cultural impact. The discrepancy between production costs and audience response became increasingly apparent. This was particularly evident in formats that strayed from the creators' own biographies. Attempts to present themselves as purveyors of leadership, inspiration, or lifestyle met with limited interest. Critics noted that public expectations were different. The audience associated the names not with expertise in these areas, but with personal drama. This gap between self-image and external perception proved difficult to bridge. Projects with an emotional core also fell short of expectations. Series addressing important social issues found recognition in niche audiences but failed to build a broad following. Viewership remained modest, and the media impact was minimal. In the logic of major streaming platforms, this sends a clear message. Attention is there, but loyalty is not. A similar pattern emerged in the audio sector. The launch of a podcast with high-profile guests initially generated considerable interest. The first season was heavily promoted and followed closely. However, after the season ended, there was no continuation. The collaboration ended without a sustainable format having been established. Here too, it became clear that a strong debut alone is not enough to remain relevant in the long term. The overall impression was one of content collapse. Not because the productions were of poor quality, but because they failed to retain their audience. In a media landscape characterized by oversupply, curiosity alone is not enough. Those who want to remain relevant must continuously meet or redefine expectations. This is precisely where many subsequent projects failed. This decline in reach had immediate consequences. Streaming services measure success not only by headlines but also by numbers that justify subscriptions. If formats fail to reach this threshold, exclusive contracts lose their appeal. However, the public debate translated this pragmatic mechanism into moral categories. Declining interest became perceived failure, and expiring contracts were transformed into a supposed dismissal. Thus, perceptions shifted further. Content, once celebrated as proof of independence, was suddenly seen as a liability. Every new publication was no longer viewed as an opportunity, but as potential further evidence of decline. This expectation was self-reinforcing and made it difficult for new projects to be evaluated objectively. The so-called content collapse is therefore less a sudden collapse than the result of a gradual alienation between supply and demand. It explains why the media response became increasingly shrill, even though the actual developments were comparatively unspectacular. The question that arises from this is crucial. Can the public's lost trust be regained? Or does this moment mark the point at which attention irrevocably moves on? While public attention waned, one factor remained constant: costs. This is precisely where the silent pressure intensifies, a pressure that only appears in a distorted form in many reports. There is talk of gigantic debts, financial catastrophe, and impending bankruptcy. The reality is less spectacular, but no less tense. It's not about sudden insolvency, but rather an imbalance between declining income and persistently high expenses. In the early years after stepping back from royal duties, Money flowed relatively easily. Large contracts created an impression of financial invulnerability. Streaming deals, book releases, and exclusive partnerships ensured stable income and an aura of unlimited possibilities. This period also shaped their lifestyle. Large properties, international travel, comprehensive security measures, and a professional network of advisors, producers, and lawyers became the new normal. But such sources of income are rarely sustainable. Contracts expire, projects end, and advances dry up. This is precisely where the current pressure comes in. While the large payments from previous deals have largely been settled, the fixed costs remain. The property in Montecito is emblematic of this development. High acquisition costs are accompanied by ongoing expenses that accrue year after year. Taxes, maintenance, staff, and insurance add up to sums that cannot simply be reduced. Added to this are security costs, which represent a significant expense for internationally renowned figures. Round-the-clock protection. Travel with additional staff and technical security measures are not luxuries, but standard practice in this environment. There is little room for savings here without taking risks. These expenses continue regardless of whether new revenue is generated. Ongoing costs also accrue behind the scenes. Even in a reduced form, an organization like Arkwell requires legal support, accounting, and administrative structures. Added to this are expenses for ongoing legal disputes, which, while civil in nature, nevertheless incur substantial fees. These costs don't disappear with the end of a media contract, but continue for years. In this context, it becomes clear why financial strain arises even without debt in the traditional sense. It is the pace of change that is causing the strain. Revenues that used to flow regularly have become uncertain or project-based. At the same time, lifestyles are based on assumptions from a period when incomes were significantly higher. Public discourse drastically oversimplifies this situation. Liquidity pressure becomes a debt burden. Cautious budgeting turns into panic. Such exaggerations ignore the fact that assets exist and financial flexibility is available. However, they also don't ignore the possibility that adjustments might be necessary. Reduced spending, new revenue streams, or strategic realignments are typical reactions to such phases. This is precisely where the core of the financial story lies. It's not about a sudden collapse, but rather about whether the transition from large, short-term revenue streams to more sustainable models will succeed. Lifestyle brands, speaking engagements, or new media formats can offer new perspectives, but they require startup time and investment. They don't solve the problem in the short term. The silent pressure, therefore, arises from the gap between expectation and reality. The outside world continues to expect a life of the highest standard, while revenues must be planned more cautiously. This discrepancy makes every decision visible and vulnerable. Every new contract is interpreted as a rescue. Every failure is seen as proof of failure. Ultimately, the situation boils down to a key question. Are adjustments perceived as a strategic move or as a sign of decline? The answer determines whether financial reality is viewed objectively or continues to be portrayed as a dramatic doomsday scenario. Perhaps the most effective driver of the current narrative is a linguistic distortion that has deeply permeated the reporting. Terms like convicted and millions in debt appear repeatedly, even though they don't stand up to scrutiny. This is precisely the core of the grand lie that transforms a complex situation into a seemingly clear-cut verdict. The impact of these words is stronger than their truth, because they cater to a need for clear-cut blame and definitive conclusions. The claim of a gigantic debt burden is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how media contracts function. Large contract volumes are often interpreted in the public perception as personal wealth. In reality, however, they usually describe the total amount of production budgets, development costs, and fees over several years. From this figure, a private obligation is constructed in exaggerated portrayals, one that never existed. The transition from contract value to alleged debt is rhetorically effective, but factually incorrect. The same applies to the term conviction. It suggests a completed legal act, a formal attribution of guilt by a court. In reality, no such procedure, no ruling, no legal consequence exists. Nevertheless, this language is deliberately employed because it triggers emotions. It creates the image of a moral reckoning that goes far beyond dispassionate market disputes. Platforms that will not renew contracts are portrayed as judges, thus stylizing economic developments as punishment. This conflation of law and market is no accident. It follows the mechanisms of digital attention. The more drastic the wording, the greater the reach. The more definitive the tone, the stronger the reaction. In this logic, differentiation loses its value. What matters is not whether a claim is correct, but whether it is shared widely and provokes outrage. The presence of legal issues in the surrounding context further amplifies this effect. Ongoing civil proceedings, settlements, and appeals generate buzzwords that can easily be misunderstood or deliberately misinterpreted. Complex legal disputes are transformed in the public narrative into insinuations of guilt, while the fact that these are civil lawsuits concerning rights, not punishment, fades into the background. This creates a climate in which repetition replaces truth. The more often a false claim surfaces, the more familiar it becomes. Familiarity, in turn, is mistaken for credibility. Even people who are skeptical of the details begin to accept the underlying narrative, not because they are convinced, but because the alternative explanation seems more complicated. This dynamic distracts from the actual developments. Instead of discussing strategic missteps, market changes, or image problems, the debate focuses on imagined extremes. This prevents a dispassionate analysis and intensifies polarization. Supporters see an unjust witch hunt, critics a deserved one. Both sides are reacting to a distorted picture. Ultimately, it must be noted that neither an avalanche of debt nor a conviction exists. What does exist is a reputation problem, exacerbated by economic pressure and media mechanisms. The great lie is so powerful because it's simple. It offers a clear ending where reality only knows transitions. But these transitions are precisely what determines what comes next. Ultimately, all the threads of this story converge on an open, uncomfortable question about the future. Not a courtroom, not a list of debts, and not a single contract will decide the fate, but rather time, strategy, and perception. The coming months are considered a critical phase because several factors are at work simultaneously and reinforcing each other. Public attention has waned. Professional networks have thinned, and financial resources are under pressure. It is precisely this simultaneity that makes the situation so fragile. A central point is the question of returning to familiar stages. Every public appearance, every new project is now judged differently than just a few years ago. Where curiosity once reigned, skepticism now prevails. This necessitates clearer decisions. Either trust can be rebuilt and expectations realistically managed, or every activity will continue to be interpreted as evidence of decline. The room for experimentation has shrunk. The familial dimension is also gaining in importance. The possibility of reverting to old structures is being intensely debated in the public sphere. It symbolically represents the question of whether bridges should be repaired or permanently demolished. Any movement in this direction would have enormous symbolic implications, both positive and negative. A step forward could be interpreted as insight, hesitation as stubbornness. In a climate of constant observation, even silence becomes a statement. Parallel to this is the economic reality. Without new long-term sources of revenue, the pressure to set priorities will increase. Reduction, restructuring, or a conscious withdrawal from constant presence would be conceivable strategies. But these very steps contradict the image that many still expect. The balancing act between public expectations and financial prudence becomes a tightrope walk. Perhaps the greatest challenge, however, lies in the narrative itself. As long as the story is told from the outside, there is little room for corrections. Those who do not actively define what they stand for will be defined by headlines. This is especially true in a phase where any delay is interpreted as weakness. At the same time, hasty action carries the risk of further missteps. This story isn't at an end, but at a crossroads. One path leads to a slow return to normalcy, far removed from superlatives and scandals. The other to a continuing spiral of justification, resistance, and diminishing relevance. Which direction is taken is decided less by external judgments than by inner clarity and consistency. Loud pronouncements of guilt and condemnation may generate attention, but they explain nothing. The real decision is made quietly, far from the headlines. The question remains whether this phase will be used as a necessary break or remembered as the beginning of a lasting loss of significance. The story surrounding Meghan Markle has become a lesson in modern media mechanics over the past few months. Sensationalist headlines constructed an image of guilt, condemnation, and ultimate failure, even though these terms don't stand up to objective scrutiny. In reality, a far more complex scenario emerges. An initial surge in popularity created expectations that ultimately went unfulfilled. Declining attention, structural problems in the professional environment, and persistently high costs led to noticeable pressure, not a sudden collapse. The withdrawal of PR partners and the decreasing response to media projects were amplified in the public perception into moral judgments. Economic market decisions were transformed into alleged punishments. At the same time, the deliberate use of legally charged terms reinforced a narrative that was simpler but more inaccurate than reality. The repetition of these exaggerations created a semblance of certainty where uncertainty actually prevails. At its core, this is neither a judgment nor an avalanche of debt, but a phase of reorientation under intensified conditions. The coming months will determine whether adaptation and strategic clarity succeed, or whether the public narrative continues to be dictated from the outside. This story is not over. It stands at a turning point where decisions carry more weight than headlines. The question remains for the readers: is this a temporary crisis from which a new chapter can emerge, or the moment when public relevance is irretrievably lost? Which development seems more likely?